Well, I've got someone really interesting here, Geci Karuri-Sebina, and she's speaking from Johannesburg. And she's a woman who's been really around the block. She's worked in state institutions, local government, parastatal ones as well. So I think she knows the delights and dilemmas of being a bureaucrat. But also, she lectures at university, she's into civic tech initiatives. She helped set up the African Innovation Summit. She's involved in the Emergence Network. What can I say? Plus, and this I love, she said, I'm now going to do things that feel right, where I align myself with all my values and go on a journey of learning. Anyway, so my first question to you, you always try to link innovation and social purpose in so much of what you do. Give me a sense of what all that's about.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Charles, for having me. This is really exciting for me. Yeah, so I guess like many people, I started off wanting to, growing up as a young African girl and in fairly difficult contexts, wanting to feel that I was doing something meaningful, working in and contributing to something that was good. And I initially went into very technical fields. So I started off in computer science, went into architecture, and I loved those fields. I love the technical work. I think I'm good at it. But it did feel a bit isolated from the real world issues as I'd experienced them and that I really wanted to be engaged with. So I think it started from that into seeing how one could apply it. And that began, working in South Central LA in the mid 90s. And these were early days of, computers and PCs and conversations about the digital divide. And looking at how, even though I worked at an university, a fairly big university research unit, how I could contribute in that space in communities. We moved to South Africa, and here the conversations were around technology for development. And so government was asking questions about how could we use new and emerging technologies to uplift poor communities, and I began sort of dabbling in that. So I think I've held this belief that we can use this technological knowledge and creativity that we have to do things that are meaningful, but that has somehow to be linked to our consciousness and also to our contexts. And that's kind of what I've tried to do, initially through big institutions, increasingly in more diffuse ways.
That's interesting. I mean, in some way, I'm jealous of you having been there right at the heart of it all in LA and so on. I mean, as you described there, really, so much of what you do is thinking about the future. I mean, one of the things you were on the ministerial task force for the fourth industrial revolution. Well, what are the big issues you think are relevant here in terms of our conversation?
Yeah, so I think technological change and its impact is real. We can't ignore that. It's changing many aspects of our lives. It's changing how we govern. It's changing possibility. But for me, the issue isn't so much how we can catch up with this idea of digital transformation, the 4IR that we're chasing, but really how to be much more engaged in the what, the why, and the how. So which technologies are we talking about? How could we be using them to transform? So if we're talking about, for example, the property sector and prop tech, or the financial sector and fintech, how can we use tech to transform property markets and financial systems, which have been excluding and have been very problematic, rather than just using it to make them more efficient and doing, in a way, continuing to be problematic and exclusionary in our context? And then whose technologies are we talking about? How can we get better at leveraging African skills and African creativity and technological development to really address the issues that we face, like I talked about in terms of things in our context. So that's what really excites me in thinking about technological change.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way you're bringing up the notion that there's a sort of cultural dimension to this. Clearly Africa in all its facets and richness. It's not just sort of LA transported to there or Beijing imported to Africa. So that's really interesting. I mean, the other thing, I mean, this links to what you've just said to some extent. Obviously civic tech is important and so on. And this thing about, I suppose, people-based technology and empowering people through technology. What are the big developments you've seen? I mean, they may differ in different parts of Africa, of course.
Yeah, and that's true. I think they do differ. There are some very context-specific issues, but there's some general ones. So masses of young people, so this big youthful population we have with its creative energy, surrounded by inspiration from their frugal contexts, but also just boundless in terms of aspiration and imagination. Access, I think, has also been spreading across the continent. And so I've been recently citing some reports talking about 650 million mobile users in Africa, 525 million internet users. So these numbers surpass European numbers, surpass North American numbers. What's the potential of that? And then, in countries where we're also beginning to see then people combining the two. So young, conscious activists who want to use technology for social good, and they're doing it, sometimes in very difficult contexts, and some of it working with local government and other providers to try and improve services, some a bit more counter-establishment and that sort of thing. But, we've got these budding spaces where there's certainly a buzz, and ideas like civic tech, I think, are really of the time. There's a lot of potential there, and that's what we're trying to encourage.
And is that true across Africa? Let me just simplify. North Africa, Middle Africa, whatever that is, Southern Africa, is it roughly the same or?
I think it's actually, in fact, it's even difficult to say it regionally. I think it's quite country specific. So there's certain, I think, key hotspot areas, So South Africa, I think, is quite exciting. Nigeria has been exciting for a long time. Kenya is really well known, particularly around mobile tech and that sort of thing. Algeria. So I think there are countries where there's quite a lot, some kind of almost even critical masses beginning to concentrate. There are other places, like I've got a friend who's been doing work in Mozambique, so much, maybe fewer activities going on, but I would say there's stuff going on everywhere, but I think there are a few countries where there's a real concentration of energy in the civic tech space.
But does that always require, a relatively high level of development, or is sometimes a place that maybe relatively less economically developed still have strong civic tech initiatives? Is that true?
So I think it could be both. So access is obviously one of the prerequisites. So countries that perhaps have less internet access or super high data costs, and that's really difficult to deal with. I think in those spaces we see less. There are possibly also language issues that make it difficult for us to see who's doing what. So remember, we've still got a whole range of francophone countries. So when I talk about my friend in Mozambique, I would know little about Mozambique because I don't speak Portuguese, and so I probably don't look at Mozambique very much. But some other people do. So I think that we also perhaps miss seeing or recognizing activity where it is. But I do think that, if I look at countries like, Uganda has quite a lot going on, and maybe one doesn't necessarily think of Uganda as a high income country. I think of the ones I've mentioned, only South Africa is a middle income country. So most of these other countries would be, I think, places where people are doing extraordinary things in fairly developmental contexts.
And you just picked up the word francophone and stuff like that. Presumably there's also some sort of richness happening. I don't know what, Senegal, Ivory Coast or whatever. Is that true?
I'm embarrassed to say I know a lot about what's happening there in innovation in general. In terms of civic tech in particular, no. And that's my point about perhaps we're missing a lot. I'm quite excited recently to have gotten acquainted with a French guy who is specifically looking at francophone countries and trying to see what's happening in Mali, what's happening in Senegal. And so I'm hoping through our connection with him, we might begin to pick up more of that. But this divide by language is a real issue in Africa.
Yeah. But one of the things that's coming through, whatever the actual specific detail, is this question of energy. There's things happening. We looking at it from Europe sometimes think, there's this big Africa, but we don't really know enough. And what I like when you told me about the African Innovation Summit, it revealed itself. What was it? Cape Verde, 2014, 300 people. Kigali, 2018, 3,000. My God. And had you had one this year, 2020, I don't know how many. You were all part of that, setting that up. Tell me a bit about what the atmosphere was like. What was it like in Kigali? You were there.
Yes, yes, yes. So I've actually been supporting this vision of two guys, let me say, out of West Africa. So Olugbenga Adesina from Nigeria and Ambassador Jose Brito from Cape Verde. And it's really been this idea that, look, we've got this vast potential in Africa based on one of our most important and significant natural resources, which is our people, right? And so we've got all of this culture, indigenous knowledge, innovation, creativity, energy, aspiration that I talked about. So we're not just a market, we're also creators and innovators. But we're also aware that our ecosystems, for some reason, haven't been robust enough, haven't been enabling enough. And so we really need to strengthen, the actors, the linkages across sectors. And so the idea, the simple idea for AIS was to offer, from a non-governmental initiative, the space for that. Otherwise, if one doesn't do something, you're left sitting in your corners saying that we need better governance and governance is poor, and you just stay in your frustrated corner, and that's kind of how things go sometimes. So the platform was created. The energy in Kigali was pretty remarkable. I mean, there were these rich conversations happening about everything from education and food and health, exhibitors showing their amazing innovations, to conversations about, well, who is the problem in the situation, who needs to do what, and that was quite rich. But in fact, Charles, I think what might interest you is that one of the programs we had there that might link to the idea of the creative bureaucracy was we had a special session we'd organized for the first time in Kigali, which was around, we call it an evening with the creatives, right? So we invited these designers, musicians, artists, poets, DJs, and we were exploring this idea that our consciousness is not separate from our creativity and our innovation, right? So part of our science and technology is our culture and identity and our narrative and our sense of being, and that these things matter all together. And it was a pretty amazing evening. And by the end of that evening, what was really pretty inspiring, I think, and exciting is that everybody agreed that this couldn't just be a side evening show. That in fact,
Right.
in future, this had to be core, had to be main stage. It was basically decreed that the conference in future has to do that, has to integrate what we were calling a creative session on the side with the main conversation we were having about our innovation.
Yeah, 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 no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that that reminds me of is because you're obviously having so many elements, let's call them the fragments of innovation together. Sometimes people talk about an innovation ecosystem. Do you see that slowly sort of, in some sense, coming together, which obviously the ecosystem is different parts, it's public, private, civic worlds, and so on. Uh, can you see some, I don't know, seedlings of that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of effort towards achieving that. So a few of our countries have begun to take formal measures. So South Africa, I believe Algeria, a few others have began to look at this idea of national innovation systems, the NIS as we call them, and
Yeah.
really trying top down to foster a very specific policy-led framework for how this could happen. And that's had, I think, its successes and challenges. I would say there are some generic challenges still across the continent, challenges of access, I think I might have mentioned, regulatory regimes, a poor articulation sometimes between, for example, the formal R&D systems and universities and what's happening in communities, the formal and informal kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
separation. So it may play out uniquely in different places, but I think some of those challenges are fairly generic. In South Africa in particular, I think one of our challenges is, again, the articulation between this high sort of top-down idea of the NIS with a lot of the local innovation systems that even then are not the same everywhere. So from town to town or region to region, there's a lot of specificity, I think, that gets lost in this kind of generic approach, and we struggle, and I think we're working through that, how to articulate better.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think all of that just reminds me also, I suppose, I don't want to, I mean, many people externally look unfavorably on African bureaucracies, and I know Africa is very, very, very big. And I think we always have to sort of avoid cliches. But one thing, it just struck me that sometimes, you're struggling in this towards a new economy in a way, but an economy based on also people driven and empowered, not just top down tech. whereas perhaps those systems are a bit sort of rigid, old world or old economy thinking. I mean, would you say that's true?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I mean, I guess to your question, is the bureaucracy here worse than it is elsewhere? I think bureaucracies everywhere probably get a pretty bad rep, and perhaps where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah,
But I honestly do feel that look, I've engaged with bureaucracies around the world, so obviously here in the US, in the EU, several Asian countries, and I think here, on the one hand, I could say I've experienced the best and the worst of the bureaucratic experience. But I think there are also a lot of, you say the word cliche, there are a lot of unhelpful cliche narratives that sometimes go with that. So here, for example, people like to say that there's a lack of capacity
yeah, yeah,
in the public sector in particular. And there they're referring to skill or competence. And I've largely found that not to be the case at all. Actually, with
yeah,
highly competent and skilled people. In fact, we export them all over the place. So that surely can't be, it. So I think there are clearly some issues that really beg serious attention here. So here we've been studying issues around the political administrative interface. So there are real challenges
yeah,
there. The need to strengthen both responsibility and accountability. And how do we do that? How do we open up more? How do we see governance not as being something that government holds, but how do we explore the shared responsibility? How do we get a more active and committed corporate sector? How do we get civil society to be better enabled? How do we get those partnerships going? So I think there's a lot that can and should be done. But no, I don't really buy into the hype of just sort of rubbishing
yeah, yeah. No, no,
bureaucracy or government. Yeah.
yeah, I'm really pleased you're saying that, because I've just, in my experience, I've found that there may be a problem. There may be all sorts of Africa-specific problems, but sometimes when I started all my creative city thinking 35 years ago, I kept on seeing these initiatives that were coming out of places like Africa and Asia, India, or somewhere, and I thought, Christ, if only we had been that imaginative. So often it could be a problem, but it may be flipped into some amazing opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I think there's so much opportunity to learn. And maybe that's partly been the challenge. I think there's been a lot of unidirectionality in the way we've
yeah,
thought
yeah,
about
yeah.
learning, like who needs to learn from whom. Maybe that's beginning to change, I hope.
Well, I mean, that leads me to something that I hope at the end we agree. We should do some sort of creative bureaucracy related initiative in Africa where we're sort of combining, just see what's happening in both places. Are you up for that, Geci?
I'm in, and it's on record.
Okay, great, brilliant. I've got a couple of more questions. One of them is to do with vibrancy, and when we look at sort of African cities, and I remember, Warwick Market in Durban, and I thought, oh my God, this beautiful informality, slightly crazy at one level, and then I'm thinking of formality. And I'm just thinking these are again perhaps cliches about how do you have rules and regulations in a setting where often people are just trying to survive and just bursting out to do whatever they need to do. Can you just say a few things about that formal, informal stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so informality is and you can't ignore it in most developing and specifically African contexts. I'm very influenced in thinking about this by the work of Paul Jenkins, who
Uh-huh.
talked about the fact that the only thing that makes the informal informal, are the rules set by those in power. So, there is
All
this
right. Can you repeat that
elite
slowly? Repeat that slowly.
so the only thing that makes the informal informal are the rules set by those in power.
Yeah,
So
excellent.
we
Yes.
have some consensus about what's acceptable and formal, and we decide that the rest doesn't fit those rules. And often those rules, all of us will be aware, are not dynamic enough. We're also all aware that there's a lot that's very informal in the formal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Lots
yeah.
of conversations and deals and decisions that are not just following the script. We're also aware that there's a lot that's very formal, in fact, in the informal. So people tend to speak about the informal in terms of a lack of structure or a lack of power and systems and rules. But in fact, they're there, and in fact, sometimes much more strongly enforced than formal rules. So I think for me, cities, and particularly city governments and city planners, and we elites who are part of that, I think have to make sense of what something different, which could even be something better, could look like if we could understand the spaces that surround us and address or help to address or contribute to the challenge. I think there's a lot of exciting opportunity in revisiting the aesthetic and the possibility of development. You're mentioning Warwick Triangle. That's an amazing case study out of Durban here around how one could in fact look at areas like, or issues like traditional medicine and informal traders, and really incorporate them in the built environment, not just by allowing them, because often it's not just a permission issue, but actually designing it into the fabric of
Yeah, yeah.
space, and what a richness that can produce. So I love the work of visionaries like Olalekan Jeffus in Nigeria, who offers these powerful counter imaginaries that are really informed by informality and by a set of other prompts that many of us don't really think of or recognize as being valuable. I've been working with local South African urban designer, Tiresh Govender, exploring different or alternative representations and metaphors for what's the African city and what could it look like. And so I think that the distinctions perhaps are of less interest to me. I mean, they're evident, obviously, especially in countries that are very unequal, like South Africa. But the potential, I think, in really letting that play through and really beginning to engage with our context, our realities, not the textbook stuff, is possibly so exciting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought cities up because, of course, you are also a city person, and actually, our conceptions of cities are probably quite narrow, and that formal informal thing. Perhaps the negative side of the informality, there are versions of that in many other regions of the world. They might just have different names, and we won't mention what those names are, but I completely agree with you. Um, One thing I was interested in, because you're part of something called the Emergence Network, and this is sort of perhaps where you're emerging too, I don't know, where you curate things, you create and curate things perhaps. Just tell me a tiny bit about that, because this is also about imagination and actually thinking afresh and not just being stuck in past patterns.
Yeah, so it certainly is a curious space, and I hope it continues to be. That's really what I'm enjoying about it. So the Emergence Network, I met its lead curator, Bayo Akamolefe, probably about 8 years ago or so. And I found there a kind of a space where there's this amazing band of people and communities who think really deeply and really differently about a whole range of things. So in South Africa, we like talking about, in fact, in Africa in general, we like talking about decolonizing. And this has been a really decolonial space, of course, not in terms of, sort of white men on horses and guns, but, the decolonizing imagination, just really
Yeah.
expanding what's possible in terms of how we think even about, they had a conference recently on the wilds beyond climate change, and ideas of climate justice. So what does it mean to discuss something like climate change in a post-activist way? They frame this question that's on their website if anybody's interested. What if the way we respond to crisis is part of the crisis?
Yeah.
So what if we took a different stance? What if we were more humble and more open in the questions we were asking? So I think I met this community at a time where I had a lot of niggling suspicion about being complicit in reproducing some of the challenges that I was trying to counter. I'm trying to work on poverty, inequality, unsustainability, prejudice, hypocrisy, all of these issues
Yeah.
that we all think we're working on. But sometimes you realize, okay, so I've been working on this for 10 years, 20 years, and I'm not sure that the questions I'm asking, I'm not sure the work that I'm doing is really changing very much. And I think what this inquiry allowed me to do was to explore other roles for myself, other possibilities, but also to begin recognizing that in fact there are many occluded voices and ways of thinking about and doing that aren't perhaps part of what I learned in school
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
what I've been able to engage with being in big institutions. So for me, it's really been a space of questioning and inspiration. We do a lot of experimentation, and I'm learning a lot. So I really feel like a baby in the context, but it's a space that's become very precious to me.
No, I like that a lot because it's so difficult to unlearn sometimes what one's learned, and also the patterns of thinking we have. are such that they're so often embedded and etched into oneself that I think finding contexts and opportunities to sort of, wow, I mean, just to have some ease of the soul or even the mind, which then becomes more open. I love that. I think I'm going to join your, if I may, join your
Please.
emergent network. Well, look, Geci, this has been great, and I hope we're going to have the opportunity to have other conversations through time. And what else can I say? But thank you very much.
And our conference in Africa, so let's not forget that.
Absolutely, that we will do together. I'd love to do that.